Breaking news tonight, and this is absolutely massive. The United States Supreme Court just dropped a unanimous 9-0 decision that is sending shockwaves across the entire nation. When I say unanimous, I mean every single justice, from the most conservative to the most liberal, agreed on a ruling that carries enormous implications for the Second Amendment and the future of gun rights in America. This is rare. This is powerful. And this is the kind of decision that doesn't just affect one state or one policy, it reshapes the entire legal landscape nationwide. We're talking about a ruling that could fundamentally shift how courts handle Second Amendment cases for years, maybe decades to come. The Department of Justice is scrambling. Anti-gun states are in crisis mode. And gun rights advocates are celebrating what might be the most significant constitutional victory in modern history. So stay with me, because we're about to break down exactly what happened, why every justice agreed, what this means for you right now, and what's coming next in this explosive legal battle. This is one of the most important rulings in years, and you need to understand every detail. Let's start with the basic. What was this case actually about? The Supreme Court was reviewing a policy that attempted to restrict certain firearms and firearm accessories under the claim that they fell outside Second Amendment protection. The government's position was that these items were unusual, dangerous, or not commonly possessed for lawful purposes, and therefore could be banned or heavily regulated without violating constitutional rights. The case originated when gun owners challenged the restriction, arguing that the policy was a clear infringement on their right to keep and bear arms. Lower courts were divided. Some sided with the government, accepting broad interpretations of what could be restricted, while others ruled that the policy violated the Second Amendment under the historical tradition test established in the Bruin decision. As the case worked its way through appeals, legal experts on both sides recognized that this was a critical moment. The Supreme Court agreed to hear the case, and from the oral arguments, it was clear that the justices were deeply skeptical of the government's reasoning. What gun owners wanted to know was simple. Does the Constitution protect their right to own these items, or can the government ban them based on subjective claims about public safety? The stakes were enormous because the outcome would set the standard for countless future cases involving everything from magazine capacity limits to suppressor regulations to firearm feature bans. Now let's talk about what a 9-0 ruling actually means, because this is crucial to understanding the power of this decision. When all 9 justices agree, across the entire ideological spectrum, it sends an unmistakable message to lower courts, federal agencies, state governments, and future litigants. This isn't a narrow 5-4 decision that leaves room for doubt or reinterpretation. This is the Supreme Court speaking with absolute clarity and unity. Unanimous rulings carry special weight in American constitutional law. They're harder to challenge, more difficult to narrow in future cases, and they create strong precedent that lower courts must follow. When the court is divided, states and agencies often try to find loopholes, test the boundaries, or wait for the composition of the court to change. But when it's 9-0, there's nowhere to hide. The message is clear. This principle is so fundamental, so deeply rooted in constitutional law, that even justices with vastly different judicial philosophies all see it the same way. Unanimous rulings often have immediate nationwide effect because there's no dissent to cite, no alternative interpretation to cling to, and no wiggle room for creative lawyering. And here's what makes this even more significant: 9-0 decisions in major Second Amendment or constitutional rights cases are incredibly rare. In an era of deep political division and polarized courts, seeing every justice on the same page tells you that the government's position wasn't just weak. It was constitutionally indefensible. So what exactly was the government arguing, and why did it fail so spectacularly? The Department of Justice and supporting states tried to make the case that the items in question could be banned because they weren't protected by the Second Amendment's text, history, and tradition. They argued that these items were dangerous, that they weren't commonly owned at the time of the founding, and that modern public safety concerns justified restricting them. They pointed to a handful of historical regulations from the colonial era and Reconstruction period, claiming these showed a tradition of allowing such bans. But the court wasn't buying it. The government's historical evidence was cherry-picked, taken out of context, and didn't actually support the broad regulatory power they were claiming. The Supreme Court has made it clear in recent decisions like Bruin that the government can't just cite random historical laws from different contexts and claim they justify modern restrictions. The historical analogs have to be genuinely comparable in terms of how they burden the right and why they were enacted. In this case, the government failed to provide credible evidence that the founders or early Americans would have accepted the kind of sweeping ban being defended. The court also rejected the argument that public safety concerns alone can override constitutional rights. Now let's get to the heart of the matter. What did the Supreme Court actually say in this ruling? The court made it crystal clear that the items at issue are protected by the Second Amendment because they are commonly owned and used by law-abiding citizens for lawful purposes. The justices reaffirmed the core principle from the Heller decision that the Second Amendment protects arms in common use, and they applied the historical tradition test from Bruin to demonstrate that there's no legitimate historical precedent for banning these items. The ruling emphasized that the government cannot circumvent constitutional protections by labeling something as dangerous or unusual when the evidence shows it's actually widely possessed and commonly used. The court also addressed the limits of agency power and legislative overreach, making it clear that regulatory convenience and political preferences cannot override constitutional right. One of the key passages in the opinion stated that the right to keep and bear arms is not a second-class right subject to different rules than other constitutional protections. The justices rejected the notion that courts should defer to the government's judgment about what firearms or accessories are necessary for self-defense. Instead, the court affirmed that the people, not bureaucrats, get to decide how to exercise their constitutional rights. So what changes right now? What's the immediate nationwide impact of this decision? The effects are both immediate and far-reaching. First, any state or local law that mirrors the restrictions struck down by the Supreme Court is now presumptively unconstitutional. That means dozens of laws across multiple states are suddenly vulnerable to legal challenge, and lower courts are bound by this Supreme Court precedent to strike them down. Gun owners who were previously prohibited from possessing these items can now legally acquire them, and retailers can resume selling them without fear of federal prosecution. The ATF and other federal enforcement agencies must immediately halt enforcement actions related to these restrictions. That means stopping investigations, dropping pending cases, and ceasing prosecutions that rely on the now unconstitutional policy. States with the most restrictive gun control regimes, places like California, New York, New Jersey, Illinois, and Massachusetts, are facing a massive legal crisis because many of their laws are built on the same faulty reasoning that the Supreme Court just unanimously rejected. There are also ripple effects for ongoing litigation. Dozens of cases currently pending in lower courts involving similar restrictions will now be decided in favor of gun owners based on this precedent. And perhaps most importantly, this decision sends a clear signal to state legislatures and Congress. If you pass laws that violate the historical tradition test and restrict commonly owned arms, the courts will strike them down. This is not just symbolic. This has real, immediate consequences for millions of gun owners and for the future of gun legislation across the country. But of course, not everyone is happy about this ruling, and the backlash is already building. The Department of Justice released a carefully worded statement expressing disappointment with the decision and indicating they're reviewing their options. What does that mean in practice? It means the DOJ is looking for ways to limit the damage, to issue new guidance that tries to narrow the ruling's application, or to encourage states to pass slightly different laws that they hope might survive constitutional scrutiny. Several states with strict gun control laws are already signaling resistance. State attorneys general are holding emergency meetings, drafting new legislation, and looking for any possible workaround that might preserve their regulatory schemes. Some are claiming the ruling is narrow and doesn't affect their specific laws, even though legal experts say that's wishful thinking. Anti-gun advocacy groups are mobilizing their supporters, calling the decision dangerous and reckless, and demanding that Congress pass new federal legislation to override the Supreme Court's ruling, even though that's not how constitutional law works. So what happens next? Where does this ruling take us in terms of future cases, new legislation, and the ongoing battle over Second Amendment rights? This decision is going to be cited in virtually every major gun rights case moving forward. It strengthens the hand of plaintiffs challenging magazine capacity limits, assault weapon bans, carry restrictions, and suppressor regulations. Appeals courts that have been hostile to gun rights are now bound by this unanimous Supreme Court precedent, and they're going to have to reverse course on cases they previously decided in favor of gun control. We're likely to see a wave of new lawsuits targeting state and federal restrictions that were previously considered untouchable. Gun rights organizations are already preparing litigation strategies, identifying the most vulnerable laws, and filing complaints in jurisdictions where they think they can win quickly. At the same time, anti-gun states are going to try to pass new laws with slightly different language, hoping to evade the Supreme Court's reasoning. That means more litigation, more appeals, and potentially more Supreme Court cases in the coming years. Federal rulemaking authority is also on shaky ground. Agencies like the ATF that have been issuing expansive interpretations of their regulatory power now face serious legal challenges based on this ruling's emphasis on constitutional limit. This is just the beginning of a much larger legal transformation. The Supreme Court has set a new baseline for what the Second Amendment protects, and it's going to take years for all the implications to fully play out. So stay informed, because this story is far from over. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. What do you think of a 9-0 ruling in today's polarized political climate? Does it give you hope that the Constitution still matters? Let me know your thoughts, and I'll see you in the next update.